Siemens Energy on Monday, it said problems recently unveiled that its wind turbine unit would cost it about 2.2 billion euros. Those, of course, this was well short of worst case estimates, but still casting doubt over whether it will keep the struggling business. As far as the charges were concerned, they're going to inflate Siemens Energy loss more than sixfold in 2023 to 4.5 billion euros, the company said as it published its third quarter results. Now, coming to Nigeria, Siemens Energy is expected to complete an overhaul of Nigeria's dilapidated power infrastructure 5 years later than originally planned. Here's Oladayo Orolu, who was speaking to Bloomberg, said when we conceptualized this Nigeria project in 2018, our plan was within 2 years we would be done with phase one. But then COVID happened, disrupting supply chains, which meant getting raw materials took longer than before. Kelvin Emmanuel joins us in the studio. He's the CEO of Hills Ltd to talk about power, something he talks about quite a lot. Kelvin, good to have you in Lagos.
Thank you
again.
So much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
What do you make of this update from Siemens?
I'll tell you, Rotus. You see, if you go back to 2001 and you see how the Nigerian government, the Bureau of Public Enterprise, under the leadership of then the DG, Nasser El-Rufai, and President Olusegun Obasanjo, how they unbundled the telco, unbundled NITEL, and how they led privatization and how the telecom sector has evolved. The telecom sector today controls 13% of Nigeria's GDP. You realize that the issues that Nigeria power sector has, is it from the issue of generation, the issue of the fact that Nigeria has 1,000 kilometers of gas pipeline and needs about 7,000 kilometers of gas pipeline. It has an issue of high transmission pipes. It has an issue of the lack of LPFO, low poor fuel oil. You have the fact that generating companies have impairment in their revenue because out of 11.9 million paying customers in Nigeria, only 5.6 million customers have prepaid meters. Yeah, you have an issue of TCN, which is a market operator, which now comes to the issue of the Siemens transformers. They have ailing infrastructure because not all the load that is given by the generating companies to the market operator TCN is actually taken by distributing companies through Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading Company, MBET. So now with the Nigerian Electricity Trading Act 2023 that says transmission, distribution, and generation goes to the states. Regulation for generation and transmission stays with NEC. Regulation for distribution stays with the states. You also have to look at the fact that historical tariff says that the states, these schools are owing 1.3 trillion naira. So when you look at this, you see that the government needs to adopt what it adopted with telecoms like 22 years ago, which is allow the private sector to manage the process. There is no need on bundling power and having the generating companies and distribution companies and having the government control the central lever, which is transmission as market operator. It's just like you saying that the government is going to become a market operator for the telecom industry in Nigeria. It doesn't make any sense.
Gotcha.
The impairment generating companies have is about 31%. Yeah, so generation is somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 megawatts. Yeah, it's not enough to even power Lagos and Ogun State, right? Yeah. So you want to allow the private sector to play in this sector. Siemens, for example, coming to say he had issues with the fact that he has supply chain issues post-COVID. The EPC that he projected for the project has been inflated, and conditions have changed, and it's delaying its ability to deliver completion date that is set to the government. It's not a good look. The Presidential Power Initiative will not work for solving the problem of generation, transmission, and distribution if the government doesn't realize that government has no business doing business. It's high time you allow the private sector to control all the levers of the supply chain for electricity in Nigeria.
But government still has to at least stay in the role of an overseer as a regulator. That one, you're good with that?
I agree with it completely. Government has to stay. The state governments have to adopt state electricity regulatory boards or commissions. The NEC controls generation and transmission. But in terms of the supply chain, in terms of cost-reflective tariffs, in terms of declaring a state of emergency, when it comes to ensuring that at least 80% of people who use power in Nigeria, the current 11.9 million customers, actually have prepaid meters. Yeah? it's compulsory because there's electricity theft. Yeah, you cannot provide money for the generating companies and incentivize them to make investment worth hundreds of millions of dollars, worth billions of dollars into building thermal plant, into building hydroelectricity power, into building IPP plants. Now, NNPC announced they're building 135 megawatts. They're going to use the AKK pipeline, which has been delivered for Abuja, from Ajaokuta. They'll build a turbine, and then that will generate and distribute to AEDC, right? It's a good development. But for you to incentivize companies to go into generation and invest money in generation, they have to be sure that, number one, they have access to gas, they have access to LPFO, if it's going to be hydroelectricity, because rainfall is seasonal. You can't rely on hydro. The north is disadvantaged. The north needs gas or LPFO. And for example, it needs gas. So this goes back to the Nigerian infrastructure, Nigerian Gas Infrastructure Company, NGIC, that's under NNPC. It goes back to NGM. It goes back to the Ministry of Gas and Power that is proposed. It goes back to the president. If you want to increase the supply of electricity, number one, you have to ensure that the supply chain works and allow the private sector to play.
Kelvin, the private sector needs to be paid for the investments that they're making. They need to make a return, right?
Yes.
We know there was, after the windows, the FX windows were collapsed and we had the single I&E window, the liberalization and everything, there was talk that July 1st tariffs would go up.
Yes.
And there will be more cost. But, that's been shifted to the side. How do you make that work while also looking at the impact on disposable income of the average Nigerian? Because fuel subsidies have been removed, FX, you see where the rates are going. And now you also have to include, and I'm with you, I know where you're going. I know where you're going. But how do you work? Because the government has just gotten quiet on when electricity tariffs will be raised. So how do you work that out? How do you work out that balance?
Listen, if there is 12 to 18 hours of steady electricity in Nigeria, demand for PMS would drop from 41 million liters to around 28 or 25 million liters per day.
Right, okay.
Because a lot of the consumption of PMS in Nigeria daily is to power generators.
Right, that's intuitive, that makes sense. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So if there is steady electricity, Nigerians will pay cost-reflective tariffs. Yeah, and the issue is that, look, I'll tell you, Labour has to pick a struggle.
Yeah.
Labour has to pick a struggle because you cannot expect that the government will keep providing subsidies and not allow the private sector to, because as soon as the subsidy government comes in and says we're providing subsidy, private sector hands off and say it's not the free market.
Yeah.
We're not going to make investments and then start arguing between government, Labour, a tripartite agreement on is he going to provide subsidy? Government. Okay, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Say I have a generating company. I'm expected to make $100 million a year.
Yeah.
And there's an impairment of, say, 35 or 40%, and I'm losing 40%.
Yeah.
I would rather have a system where the market pays me for my revenue so that I can service my turbines, I can buy LPFO,
Yeah.
I can pay for gas from Nigerian Gas Marketing Company, I can pay for operational costs, I can pay to the operator, than to rely on the government and say, if the market defaults and there is an impairment loss in my final settlement statement, FSS, I'm going to rely on the contracts I signed with the government and trigger the clause where the government has to provide the loss.
So you prefer the market to provide
to
that.
the government.
Right,
this is the problem the private sector has.
Right.
This is why telecom has been successful in Nigeria. And I make mention to you to say, Rotus, without the success of Nigeria's telecom sector and the Nigerian interbank payment and settling system, you won't have the fintech community that you have today in Nigeria. They are the backbone of tech.
Yeah.
So if you want to, boost manufacturing and boost production and create jobs for the people, blue-collar jobs for the people, you need to invest in power. And for you to invest in power, the government has to stay as a regulator and allow the market to play.
Yeah, yeah. Final question. Kelvin, we should have this conversation much longer next time. But real quick, they've pushed it to 2030 for Siemens. Do you think they'll meet that deadline or something could come up? Because they talk about costs and other things impacting the amount of equipment they're bringing in. Do you think they make the deadline by 2030?
I don't think it's up to Siemens. I think it's up to the Nigerian government.
Well, point well made. Point well made. Kelvin Emmanuel, CEO, Hills Ltd. Kelvin, always great to have you in Lagos.
Thank you
for joining us.